From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Call on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Cole on Congress. Today I'm pleased to welcome my colleague Jeb Hensarling to the program. Congressman Hensarling represents the 5th District of the great state of Texas. He includes Dallas and the surrounding areas. He's been a leader on the fight over the budget, financial service committees, and Frank serves on both those committees. And I've asked him to join me here today to talk about the budget, the health care bill, and some of the great challenges facing the country. But before I get there, I always like to start these things with something a little bit personal. So I'm going to mention two things about my friend Jeb Hensarling. First, we've known one another a long time.
A very long time.
Almost 20 years. When I came up here in 1991 to be the executive director of the National Republican Congressional Committee, which is our political committee that tries to elect Republicans. Jeb had exactly the same job at the National Republican Senatorial Committee, working for then Senator Phil Gramm, trying to make sure that we won some big Senate races in a bad year. So we've been good friends. We were elected the same year, and I find, because he is a Texas Aggie and of course I'm an Oklahoma Sooner, we both have exactly the same opinion of the University of Texas and their
we do share that opinion. We do share that opinion.
Anyway, it's really great to have you here. Let me start out because we're I think in the middle of a tremendous debate that's going to span really several election cycles about where we're going as a country. And what kind of federal government we're going to have. And you really have carved out the niche of being a real expert, as I know one of your mentors, Senator Gramm, was, on the American economy, on the appropriate role of the federal government in that. Where do you see the big differences between where the president wants to go in a budgetary sense and where you think we ought to go?
Well, Tom, the bottom line is, unfortunately, as a nation, we're on the road to bankruptcy. And Speaker Pelosi and President Obama are pressing on the accelerator. I mean, we had great fiscal challenges before they were elected. They have made them far more worse. Since the Democrats took control of Congress, the national deficit has increased tenfold. The president just submitted his budget, which will double the national debt in 5 years, triple it in 10 years. As a percentage of the economy, the government is now spending almost 25 cents on the dollar. This is the most it's ever spent since World War II. The post-World War II average has been 20%, so we've gone from 20% of the economy to 25% of the economy almost overnight. On the present fiscal path that Speaker Pelosi and the President have us on, number one, by the end of this decade, at 2019, we're going to be paying almost $1 trillion a year just to pay interest on the national debt. I believe the exact number is $916 billion. That's roughly $18,000 for every family in Oklahoma, every family in Texas, every family across America.
In interest payments.
In
Annual interest payments.
Interest payments alone. We're looking at the debt going from roughly 40% of our economy to 80% of our economy. I mean, we're on the pathway to being Greece. And so there are very alarming trends that are taking place now, and it bothers me how much the president and the speaker just seem to ignore this. And it's almost, Tom, like we've turned a great American ethic on its head. And that is, we were always taught, work hard today so your children can have a better life tomorrow. And instead, they've turned that on its head. It's like, let's let the government live easy today so our children have to work harder tomorrow. And right now, Democrats seemingly don't want to do anything about fiscal responsibility. And yet they won't own up to the size of the tax increases that'll be necessary to handle their budget. At the end of this decade, just to balance the budget, we would have to have a 60% tax increase. 60%. So whatever you sent Uncle Sam and what you're about to send him, multiply that by 1.6. And that's the magnitude of the tax increase just to balance the budget at the end of the decade. And so what we're really doing is we're on the pathway to being the first generation in America's history to leave the next generation with less freedom, fewer opportunities, and a lower standard of living. And I know you and I are dedicated to making sure that doesn't happen.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a question about that deficit, because I know you'll know the answer. With all this expansion in spending, with this incredible amount of new activity by the federal government, and higher taxes planned along the way, some of which we're going to see in very short order.
That we will.
Where is the budget deficit at the end of the president's projections, over an 8-10 year period?
Well, right now, the deficit is about $1.6 trillion. Under his 10-year budget, it actually comes down, but then at the end of the budget, the 10-year budget window, and that's how we budget in Washington in 10-year blocks, it goes right back up to $1 trillion of deficit. Now, every professional economist and every historian will tell you that you cannot maintain long-term a deficit to GDP or economy ratio over 3%. Under the president's budget, it never gets below 3%. And in fact, his own director of the Office and Management and Budget, basically the bureaucrat up here who writes the budget for him, has said our own budget is unsustainable because our deficit never falls below that 3% mark in the economy. So it goes up, it comes down a little, and then it goes right back up, and it is just a sea of red ink from there, Tom.
Yeah, it is. I don't think most people yet grasp, how staggering this is going to be, because we're running deficits at that point, presumably in a, quote, prosperous economy, full employment. They presume all those type of things, and yet still see a $700 billion deficit at the end of the president's tenure that, as you point out, will then explode beyond that. Let's break it down to some of the specific battles that we've actually been having up here, and let's start first with your view of the stimulus package, quote unquote stimulus, that we passed early last year, really almost exclusively on a party line vote, with some Democrats joining us, but not a single Republican involved in the passage of the stimulus.
It failed. I mean, we're still mired in almost double-digit unemployment. Since that bill was passed, we've had almost 4 million more of our countrymen lose their jobs. We have the highest unemployment rate in a generation. I mean, all it did was, when you add in the interest factor, add in another $1.2 trillion of debt on a nation that was already headed towards bankruptcy. And as you well know, this was not really an economic piece of legislation that was designed to help create jobs. It stimulated government. As most of us know, the only sector of the economy that's growing is government. We certainly added more federal workers. I think we have more federal workers making above 6 figures than at any time in our nation. Apparently, I've been told that the Washington, D.C. metro market is the only real estate market in the nation that is seemingly holding its value. And so, again, it reminds me of what the President's Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, infamously said, and that is, never let a serious crisis go to waste. Let you do things you couldn't do before. I mean, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, I don't even think he would claim this economic package. Even if you bought into Keynesian economics, which most of us don't, but if you did, it calls for the money to be spent more quickly. It calls for the money to be spent on more shovel-ready projects, and instead, this was a bill that was designed just to build big government and continue to erode the freedoms and economic opportunities of the American people. And Tom, by any measurement possible, it is an abject failure.
Well, one of my favorite lines was from another great Texan, former member of Congress, I always like to point out, got his doctorate at the University of Oklahoma, Dick Armey, who said it's like trying to win a race by fattening the jockey and starving the horse. It's just not likely to work. And I think
I hadn't heard that one from Dick Armey, but that's a wonderful.
But it's absolutely true, because the whole thrust of this was to make government bigger. There's not much in that package that incentivized the private sector. Nothing that encouraged business people to go out and hire people. Nothing that encouraged people people to really go out and purchase equipment, do things that long term would make the economy more productive. And, quite the opposite, things that sustained government at unsustainable levels at a time when, frankly, government probably should have been making some tough decisions about cutting back, and while we incentivize the private sector over time to grow in ways that would provide us the income that we need to defend the country and enjoy a good and prosperous lifestyle. Well, that was sort of the president's vision of where we should go, and as you say, it hasn't worked because he laid the marker out there.
Well, you see, he's made matters worse, Tom, and here's why. I don't know about you, but when I go back home and talk to folks in Dallas and in Southeast Dallas County, East Texas, that I represent in the 5th District, people, small businesses, investors, entrepreneurs, everybody's scared about where's this economy headed? How are we going to deal with this level of debt and deficit? I mean, they know this has an unhappy ending. It either ends in a massive tax increase, it ends in us somehow getting on our hands and knees and begging the Chinese to continue to buy our debt. And right now we're borrowing roughly 42, 43 cents on the dollar. China still is the largest foreign owner of our debt. At some point, how many more lectures from the communist Chinese about our spendthrift ways are we going to be able to take? But if the Chinese don't, then we're going to have to bid up interest rates so much. It crowds out borrowing that families have to have in order to buy a car, send a kid to college. Small businesses, the working capital they need. So it's either a massive tax increase, massive increase in interest rates, or it could be huge inflation. I mean, there could be inflation that would make us look longingly and nostalgically upon the Carter era. And I don't think anybody in America wants to go back to a time of double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, double-digit unemployment. And so the mere fact that there is no pathway to deal with the fiscal insanity, the sea of red ink, is harming job creation today. Yet on top of that, the $2.3 trillion takeover of our healthcare system. Yet on top of that, their threatened $800 billion energy tax. It creates great anxiety, great uncertainty, and nobody wants to start a new business enterprise or expand it today, and that's why we're not having any job growth.
Well, let's talk about that second leg of this particular stool. We had the stimulus. The next big piece to roll at us, of course, was cap and trade, and that was quite a battle here in the House. You were a particular leader, and as you always are in these fiscal fights and energy-related fights, but a particular leader in that battle. And we seem to have at least temporarily stalled that one over in the Senate. But give us your quick prescription of what the consequences of passing cap and trade would be for the average American.
Well, it would be huge. I mean, most of the studies I have seen show that the average American family is going to be out another $1,500 to maybe as much as $2,800 a year on average to put this national energy tax into our economy. It's hard to think of a more polite word than insanity for such a policy at a time where we are still mired in the worst recession we've had in decades, where again, millions of Americans have lost their jobs. And listen, put the whole global warming debate, even if you put credence into the theory, if Russia, if China, if India doesn't join in, I don't know of any scientist who really believes that we have done anything. I mean, Tom, I view it as unilateral economic disarmament is really what that tax is all about. And particularly for those of us in Texas and Oklahoma, it'd be devastating to our economies, just absolutely devastating.
I was once asked at a town hall meeting, was there anything good about cap and trade? And I said, well, actually there is. It's the best economic development bill China and India ever had, because we're certainly going to export a lot of industry at a tough time. They're going to move to a different and more favorable regulatory environment, and there's not a way in the world those countries are going to enact something as restrictive as this administration has proposed.
Absolutely not.
There'll be big winners in this. In terms of that, of course, we had then the stimulus, then cap and trade, and we have been embroiled now for a year, which I actually take as a sign of some hope that this battle has lasted this long in this gigantic health care debate. We've just lived through the passage, sadly, of the legislation in the House. We're working it through right now in the Senate. But I want first your critique of what the proposed changes will mean for the federal budget and the economy, and then for the quality of health care for the average American. Then I'm going to move you on to talk about a couple other things in relation to that. But
well, for so many different reasons, as you know, we thought it was a bad piece of legislation. But you know what, Tom? Even if for some reason I thought it was a good legislation, it's not something America can afford. America can't pay for the commitments it has made to current generations, much less to future generations. I wish it weren't so, but Social Security is going bankrupt. Medicare is going bankrupt. Medicaid is going bankrupt. And people don't need to take my word for it. You can go to the website of the Medicare and Social Security trustees. I believe that their most recent report says that Social Security is going broke 4 years sooner than they thought. Medicare is going broke 2 years sooner than they thought. And so a program that has been so important and a great comfort to our parents and grandparents is quickly morphing into a cruel Ponzi scheme for our children and our grandchildren. And so what we call the unfunded obligations of the federal government are somewhere in the $65 trillion area, which is over about $500,000 for every single American household. And so on top of that, what the Democrats have done is passed a new $2.3 trillion entitlement program when we can't even afford the others. So again, it's kind of like, you know, Thelma and Louise are headed over the cliff. I guess in this case it's Barack and Nancy headed over the cliff, and they're just jamming on the accelerator, and Harry's in the back seat, asleep as usual. And so they're pressing on the accelerator. And you know, I rarely use this term in political debate, and I try to always respect my colleagues, but what we're doing to future generations, borrowing money from China, sending the bill to our children and grandchildren, making promises that we have no way of keeping, frankly, it's just immoral. It's just absolutely immoral. So again, we couldn't even afford this if we wanted it, number one. And then number two, ultimately it is a further erosion of individual freedom in America. I mean,
go ahead.
Already, as you well know, you essentially now have to go to your federal government if you want to buy a home. The federal government, through what we call the government-sponsored enterprises of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, they control about 92% of the housing market. So if you want to buy a home, you have to go through the federal government. You want to buy a GMC pickup truck? Well, you got to buy it from Government Motors. Okay? And as you well know, now all of a sudden we've passed legislation that if your constituents want to send their kids to college and can't pay cash, and who can, now you got to go to the federal government if you want to get a student loan. You know, they've taken over a huge chunk of our banks, and now with this legislation, as years go by, ultimately you will have to go to your federal government if you want to see a doctor. I mean, if there's anything America stands for, it is the idea of individual freedom, unbounded opportunity, and every single day we have an erosion of that. And so now we have 159 new federal governments, boards, commissions, programs to get between you and your doctor. Ultimately, this whole system is set up towards what we call a one-payer system. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. Might take 5 years, might take 10, might even take 20, but ultimately, the system is set up to where the government will control who receives health care, who they receive it from, and what the protocols are. We're going to wake up one day, and all of a sudden, we're going to have to wait weeks and months to see a doctor of the government's choosing, who's a mediocre doctor, who tells us that they can't treat us because our illness doesn't meet some government protocol. I mean, you see it in the UK, you see it in Canada. And I'm not saying the world's coming to an end, but I'm saying America is going to have less opportunity to have health care. The quality is going to suffer. And ultimately, I've never known anything to get cheaper when you collectivize it in the government.
Absolutely true. You know, and I think one of the things that has disturbed Americans as they've grappled with what are really big issues with really profound consequences is the process whereby we've moved this. Now, one of the oldest axioms in politics is people don't care about process. for the first time in my town hall meetings, my constituents do care about process. They think this has been done behind closed doors, and they're right. They think they've seen a lot of special deals, and they're right. And they think debate and dissent has been stifled, and they're to a degree right. I know when we were on the floor debating the health care bill, I actually got up not in the substance of the debate on the bill, but in the rule debate. And the rule is certainly my Jeb knows, but my listeners, some will know and some won't, is the mechanism whereby we bring the bill to the floor and we decide how many amendments are available and how much time there's going to be to debate and what points of order can be entertained, and it's quite an important measure. But I had submitted a simple amendment. All it did was say, look, if we can save money in Medicare, and I hope we can. I'm dubious about some of the amounts they stipulate in the bill. The money stays in Medicare. We've got a program here with enormous unfunded liability at a point when millions of baby boomers are getting ready to do it. Why in the world would we take the savings out of that program to a new one? That amendment was never heard. Never had a chance to debate it on the floor, never had a chance for people to defend their actions. 65 different members, both parties submitted amendments. None of them were made in order. That's unprecedented, I think.
Yeah, 0 out of 80, I believe.
65 members, 80 total amendments. You're exactly right. But, do you have the same concerns about this just muscling through of things of this scope?
Oh, absolutely. And one thing I'll agree with the President and Speaker Pelosi on, this was a very historic piece of legislation. And it kind of begs the question, and one of our colleagues, I forget who did the calculation, but for such a historic piece of legislation, every member, if you allocate the time that they gave us to debate it on the floor, the final bill, was like 45 seconds per member to be heard on one of the most historic pieces of legislation.
Well, Bill, they were telling us will be the most important vote we ever cast.
Well, also, but the Speaker's infamous quote, well, we have to pass it to find out what's in it. And increasingly, the American people will find out what's in it. But you're right, people are paying attention to process. Now, ultimately, the Democrats backed down on this deem and pass. But it was interesting. I had a family in from my district right before that vote, and they asked me about deem and pass, and I was explaining it, and they had a little girl. I say little girl, she was in middle school, 6th, maybe 7th grade. I was explaining deem and pass, and before I could even finish, she almost leapt out of her seat and said, "That's not right." And I thought, thank you. A middle schooler can get it. If a middle schooler can get it, then, I know the rest of America got it as well. Now, they backed down on that, but still, you got the Cornhusker kickback, the Louisiana Purchase, the Gatorade, the special sweetheart deal for the labor unions, the special sweetheart deal for the pharmaceuticals. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so, there was just bartering and trading, and frankly, it was, I believe, a very shameful chapter in the legislative history of the House and the Senate. And the American people know, and they know it's tainted this legislation. And, I don't think the American people are going to be ignored on this. None of us should lick our finger and put it in the wind to decide how we vote. On the other hand, on a major piece of legislation that the American people have followed for a year, and not one single survey in America indicated a majority of the people want it. It was evident. The American people don't want this. But yet, Speaker Pelosi rammed it through the House, and unfortunately, the rest is history.
Well, and of course, as you know, we are, quote, the people's house. It's actually our constitutional job, pretty much, not on every occasion. Sometimes there's emergencies, or sometimes, frankly, it's a minor issue or people don't know much about it. But as you say, when the public will is as crystallized as it was in this case, probably the wise thing to do would be to adhere to that. I ask you this because we've been very critical, and I think honestly appropriately so, of the stimulus, of cap and trade, of health care, of the general thrust of the administration. But, it's not enough just to be a critic. And one of the things I've always admired about you is I've never seen you criticize without having an alternative, without saying there's better ways to go, there's a better way to move forward as a country. What are some of the things you think we ought to be doing to rein in the debt, to get our fiscal house in order and begin to get the economy growing again?
Well, three different things, Tom. Number one, the budget process is broken. If the budget process was a machine, it is tooled as a government spending machine. It is not tooled as a family savings machine. So I've introduced a piece of legislation called the Spending Deficit Debt Control Act. And it's a little inside baseball, but it reforms the budget process. Just a few examples. Number one, most people don't know this, but the budget doesn't even have the force of law. At best, it is a mere suggestion. So my legislation would actually make it the law of the land. Second of all, we have this thing called baseline budgeting that you're aware of that automatically inflates the growth of every government program. I mean, it's an accounting process that would make Bernie Madoff blush. Okay, we get rid of that. We set up a rainy day fund so that when there are good times, and I'm mixing metaphors here, you put hay in the barn, so in the bad times you take it out. And so it is a collection of a lot of different things, including sunsetting that we have in Texas. I don't know if y'all have that in Oklahoma or not. You ought to get it. So that these government agencies...
We'll have a new governor shortly, and I think we may be able to do that.
So that these government agencies don't live forever, but they actually have a finite life. So that's number one. Number two, you have to put out an actual plan that sooner or later actually brings us back from the brink of fiscal insanity. I've co-sponsored a piece of legislation along with our ranking member of the Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, called the Roadmap for America, that ultimately, absolutely, scored by the Congressional Budget Office, will preserve our social safety net programs for this generation of seniors and make them fiscally sound by modernizing them for the next generation of seniors, makes them perpetually fiscally sound. And so I think you have to put a plan forward. And so we have one member of Congress, Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, who put forth a plan. The president doesn't put forth a plan. The speaker doesn't put forth a plan. So we actually have Republicans who are leading on the issue. The third thing I have done, and I admit it's bold, but I have co-authored an amendment to the Constitution that is a spending limit amendment. Throughout the entire post-war era, spending has averaged 20% of our economy. Right now, under this spending plan, it's going to go to 40% of our economy. At that point, our children live in smaller homes, they drive older cars, they compete for fewer jobs with smaller paychecks, and they're confined to small little dreams in America. Now, that's not our idea of the American dream. I want to force Congress finally to quit borrowing money from the Chinese and sending the bill to our children and grandchildren. So I hope to at least ignite a debate. Should there be a limit to the size of government in our life, in our American experience, and should that be enshrined in the Constitution? So I've started that debate. So those are three things I'm working on.
Well, we're down to less than a minute and a half left, so I just signal you to keep your answer short. But you've been around politics a long time, too. I mean, you've sort of been in policy, you've been in office, and you've been a pretty canny political operator. And I'm not asking for a prediction about elections, but I am asking you, in your experience, have you ever seen a time like this in terms of the focus, the attention, the concern of the American people?
Never. We're seeing people involve themselves in the political process that have never come out before. And most of what they believe in is that, you know what, we're losing our way as a country. We need to return to first principles. We need constitutional government. We need limited government. We need fiscal sanity. And we want to live in America, again, where our children are going to have brighter days and unlock those hidden vaults of opportunity. And so I'm seeing a political dynamic, Tom, I've never seen in my life, and I'm so optimistic about it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that's fundamentally the hope and the salvation. When Americans get involved, their government will respond. So anyway, thank you. Thank you for the terrific job you do. Congressman, we're about out of time, and want to thank you again for being here. I hope our listeners have enjoyed Cole on Congress, and until next time, and we'll try and bring you an equally exciting guest. You guys have a great day. Thanks.